Hello, friends. You'll have to excuse the scratchy voice. It's still early in the morning, but I have my coffee, and hopefully we're going to be good. Let's do a video on priorities when starting a new book. I've gotten some questions about this subject, and I think it's an interesting one because we've probably all had this experience where we have an idea for a story and we're excited for it, and we think about it for a while, and then maybe we write some things down, and then we decide, okay, I'm going to start this new story. I'm going to write this new book. And then we just freeze. And it feels like all of a sudden we're stuck. There are too many directions we could go. There's too much. And I don't know, maybe I'm the only one who finds myself in that situation and ends up overwhelmed. But I've gotten enough questions about it that I think my suspicion is that there are more of you out there that struggle with the same thing. And it's not just the beginning of a book. Sometimes it's the middle of a book or even the end of a book where all of a sudden we feel this sort of paralysis come over us because we just can't figure out where to go next. Well, let's talk about that. So I have written a lot of books, and over the years, I've developed a method for breaking past this sort of paralysis. And what's fascinating is that typically I'll wallow in paralysis for a while. I'll be like, oh no, I don't know what to do. And then after a little bit, I'll just get annoyed and be like, you know what? This is stupid. Why am I even bothering spending time in this state? It's not creative. It's not helping me. It's just dumb. And so rather than stay there, I will start to implement the methodology that always works for me to get out of this. And so why don't I just start with that in the first place? Well, it's because sometimes I'm dumb too. But hopefully, in talking this through, in sort of codifying it in this video, I'm not only helping you as you face this situation, but I'm helping myself because hopefully this methodology will come to mind more quickly next time. So, what is my method? It's very simple, and that's prioritize. And really, this works for a lot of decisions in life. It's not a writing strategy. It's just a general strategy, and it really does work very well for a lot of things. If you're ever feeling like you're overwhelmed by a decision, a simple priority list can go a long, long way. So let's talk, though, about very specifically, what do I prioritize when I'm starting a new book or when I'm in this position where I'm just stuck and I'm overwhelmed by the number of options I have or a number of choices. What specifically do I prioritize? Well, the thing about writing is that writing is a skill that is based on sort of compiling a whole bunch of familiar things in a way that is mostly familiar but is slightly new. So we compile words, and we compile words in a way that is familiar, right? People can read the words, but it's new. Sentences people have not yet read. Because if we just compiled sentences that people have read, they're not going to be interested in that, right? In the same way, we compile tropes and story beats and scenes, and we compile all of these things into a story in a way that is familiar, people can understand them, but is also slightly new. There's novelty in it. And so when I prioritize, the first thing that I prioritize for is, what am I compiling? What am I putting together? What is the list of things that have to be there, that are going to provide the anchor for the story, that will make everything familiar, that will make everything understandable? What are the things that I absolutely have to be? Now, these could be tropes. They could be character traits. They could be plot points, right? It could be any number of things, but what is vital that I actually communicate? What needs to be there? And after I've done that, after I've gone through and I've built my priority list, usually I end up with 5 or 6 things. Sometimes I end up with 10 things, and sometimes I end up with even more than that, right? But the truth about being overwhelmed is that 99% of the time when you are overwhelmed, it's because there are a couple real choices and a lot of false choices. Okay, and this is why priority lists work, actually. It's really fascinating how human brains work. But this is why it works. Because the majority of choices you face in life are not real choices. They're false choices, right? So, a great example of that. I'm writing my story. I'm getting to the end of it, and I realize that I can either cliffhanger, right? I can build a cliffhanger into the end, so people are excited to read the next book. I can have my character win. I can have my character lose. I can have my character just sort of exist until the end, right? And sort of like trail out. I can introduce a new character into my story. I can introduce a whole new plot, right? Without resolving the one that I'm currently doing, if I'm going to like bookend plots. I can do all sorts of things, right? I can take my character and move them to a new place. And as I'm thinking through all of the exciting end possibilities, the reality is that only a couple of those choices are probably real choices. The rest are interesting ideas that when I actually sit down to think about, I'm immediately going to reject. And when I start to make a priority list and when I start to say, okay, what is actually necessary? What do I have to communicate? I very quickly realize that I can't introduce a new character because I need to focus on the characters I have. I can't move my character to a completely new place because that defeats the purpose of what I've been trying to do this whole book. I can't introduce a new plot without wrapping this one because, again, that defeats the purpose of everything that I've been trying to do for this whole book. And so as I start to set out my priority list, I realize really quickly it's not that I have an overwhelming number of choices. I actually only have a couple of choices. And of those couple of choices, most of the time, when I list what I'm trying to achieve, one emerges as the best option. And so by simply making a priority list, by simply saying, what is it that I'm actually trying to do and what is necessary for me to get there, I can very quickly pull myself out of overwhelm. Now the question really comes down to, why don't I just do that all the time? And again, the answer is because, sometimes I'm dumb. But it is an effective strategy. It definitely works. Now, once I have identified the must-haves, like the top few things that I have. Oh, and as I write my must-have list, if I end up with 20, I reassess the list, and normally I just end up crossing all but the top 3 out, right? I only focus on the top 3, delivering those things. And often what I'll find is then as I start writing, I focus on the top 3 and other things just sort of trickle in as inspiration strikes, which is great. Okay, so once you've done that though, once you've built your priority list, then it's time to start sort of the second step, which is how do I take these familiar things and make them novel? How do I make them interesting? How do I compile them, these things that everybody has encountered before and that are familiar and that form the building blocks of what we're writing? How do I combine them in a way that is new and interesting, that provides enough novelty for my reader that they're not just like, oh yeah, I've read this before. I want, I know what's going to happen next. It's very predictable. We don't want that, right? We want somebody to be reading through and be like, I know all of these pieces, right? I'm familiar with all of these pieces, so there's no barrier for me here. But this is new and exciting, and I'm interested to see the way this all fits together. And so the second list that I write when I'm doing this prioritizing is, how do I combine these things in a novel way? How do I communicate my top 3 things, right? Again, whether that's a trope, whether that's a piece of world building information that is absolutely vital to communicate, whether that's a characteristic of a hero or a villain. Well, how do I communicate that in a way that's interesting, right? So I might have a character act. I might want to communicate that a character is fiercely committed to their nation. Okay, cool. What's an interesting way that I can communicate that? If they're just grim and dour and hard-nosed about everything being good for their country or whatever, like, that's not super interesting. But what if I took that same character and I made them work with the villain because they understand that what the villain is doing will actually be good for their country? And so what if I take a good character and I make them conflicted because they love their country so much that they're willing to work with the villain even though they know it's the villain? Do you see how you can take something that is sort of familiar, patriotism, love for country, and you can start shifting it into new and novel territory? And you can do this really for anything. Again, tropes, you can do it for characters, you can do it for world building, you can do it for all of that. But usually by the time I get through those 2 lists, right, what is absolutely necessary to communicate? That's my first list. And how do I make what I'm communicating novel? That's my second list. Usually by the time I'm done there, all of the overwhelm is gone. I have clarity and I'm excited to write again. And so if you're finding yourself stuck, and again, it doesn't have to be the beginning of a book. This is typically where I do it the most, though, is at the beginning of a book. But for you, maybe it's the middle of the book. Maybe it's the end of the book. But doing this, actually forcing yourself to sit down, prioritize, right? Don't let yourself stay in a state of overwhelm. There's no point to it. There's literally no point to it. Just force yourself to prioritize. Write down the most important things. Maybe just write a list of things that you need to communicate and then prioritize them. Write your novelty list. How do I make these things novel and interesting, right? If you do that, I guarantee you're going to find that this state of overwhelm, this state of frustration of not knowing which direction to go or not knowing what to do next, it's going to evaporate. Anyway, hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you next time.